Hello and welcome to the France 24 interview. I'm Clément Bonnereau. My guest today is Quarraisha Abdool Karim. She's the UNAIDS Special Ambassador for Adolescents and HIV. She's one of the world's leading AIDS researchers and an advocate for the rights of people living with and affected by HIV. Dr. Abdool Karim, hello.
Hi, how are you doing?
Welcome to France 24. Thank you for joining us here on the interview. Let's start by taking a look at some recent figures. I've got a graph here. New HIV infections have been reduced around the world since the late 1990s, but it seems that this decline has somewhat lost momentum, and this for the first time since the numbers began coming down. There were 1.8 million new infections in 2016. That's quite far from the UN 2020 target of just 500,000 new infections. Can you tell us what's going on?
Yes, so there is optimism in terms of the reduction of new infections. But I think in terms of the UN goal of ending AIDS as a public health threat by 2030 and the interim 2020 targets, one of our biggest challenges is preventing new infections. And it is of concern that in the last few years, we've not made enormous success in reducing those numbers, which makes it a challenge in terms of meeting the 2020 targets. And I think there are three reasons why preventing HIV infection has been particularly challenging. And the first is we have a new and burgeoning epidemic in Eastern Europe and in Central Asia. And this is largely in injecting drug use populations and young MSM. The second is that the epidemic and the spread of the virus, as we've understood the evolving epidemic, has some key priority populations around the globe. And we've not been able to reach those populations for a number of reasons. And the key ones being stigma and discrimination associated with these particular priority populations. And then also there are barriers then to accessing the services that could make a difference. And the third and the most significant is the continued very high rates of new infections in adolescent girls and young women, particularly in Eastern and Southern Africa.
Yes, it's important to note that 2/3 of these new infections have taken place in sub-Saharan Africa, and particularly affecting young girls. That's something you've been working on in South Africa, I believe. Why are young girls so affected, so much more affected than young boys by HIV/AIDS?
So the first point is that while we have 37 million people living with HIV globally, there's a disproportionate burden of this infection in Africa. Africa is home to 70% of these infections, and South Africa, which has less than 1% of the global population, has 1 in 5 infections, now at about 20%. So I've been studying the evolving epidemic in South Africa for the past 30 years. And one of the first studies that I did at a population level revealed that young women acquire infection about 5 to 7 years earlier than men. And in fact, if we look at this 15 to 24-year age group where we start to see infection in women, women can have up to 8 times more infection compared to their male peers. So this has been an important point of departure in terms of me trying to understand why and also the interventions. So let me go to the why. And in recent years, we've had some good methodological advances, which has enabled us to really get to a deeper and more granular understanding of why young girls are getting infected. And so what we did, for example, in a population-based study, we're able to isolate the viruses from recently infected individuals and interpret that data. And what that interpretation showed us was a very important insight into the cycles of transmission. And so we have young women less than 25 years, and we have men 25 to 40 years. And these young women are getting infected from men who on average are 8 or more years older than them. Now, these men are also having sex simultaneously with women 25 to 40 years, in other words, with peers. And because we are having 25 to 40-year-old men and women infecting each other, recently infected, but the men also having sex with young women under 25, we see this continuous cycle of transmission. And so the key driver of infection in young women under 25 is sex with men 8 or more years older.
Some people also say that the reason why young women are getting more infected is because prevention methods, including circumcision and condoms, have been geared mainly towards men and not towards women.
Yes. So now we know the problem and the challenge and the magnitude of it. And there's a disconnect where the problem is and what is available. And so what is available is abstinence, behavior change. So women, for example, can be faithful to their partner, but if their partner is having other partners, as I've just described, it puts them at risk. Then if we look at barrier methods that are available, male-female condoms, it requires cooperation. Medical male circumcision benefits men. It takes a while before it benefits women. But importantly, one of the new interventions, which is if an infected person goes on treatment and is virally suppressed, they prevent infection in their partner. So these are men who, and in these relationships, women have challenges in negotiating all of those things that are all requiring male cooperation. So that's one of the reasons we've been focusing on women-initiated technologies. And so one of the important breakthroughs is the use of antiretrovirals, particularly tenofovir-based regimens that, if used by uninfected people, can prevent HIV infection. So it marks for the first time an option for women-initiated. I mean, men and women can use it, but for the first time it enables women to be able to use something to protect themselves without having to discuss this or with anybody else if they choose not to do that.
Obviously, prevention is key here, but education is also quite important. There's a poll that was released recently in France. It was commissioned by SIDAction, a major AIDS charity here. It reveals that 20% of young people say they're not sufficiently informed about AIDS. There are also persistent myths surrounding HIV. AIDS, for example, a quarter of young people believe that AIDS can be cured. Do you agree with Françoise Barré-Sinoussi, the Nobel Prize winner in medicine, and also the head of SIDAction and the discoverer of HIV, that the disease has become somewhat trivialized, that people are not sufficiently informed about it, that more needs to be done to educate young people and bust the common myths about HIV/AIDS?
I do. And I think when we first started to see AIDS, even before the discovery of HIV, what most of us saw was a very visible disease and quite devastating pictures of very young people very, very ill. And, young people don't get sick, and in a way they feel invincible. And we have a whole new generation in the 30 years that we've been trying to find solutions, understand the epidemic, respond to the epidemic, who just have no visual of that period. And I think, some important documentaries that are being released is a reminder of it. But with treatment, we've really transformed the face of epidemic from one of illness and inevitable death to one where it's chronic and manageable. So you can't really differentiate between who has AIDS, who doesn't have AIDS. And I think there's a certain amount of complacency. And so one of my priority activities, as with several other people, is can we keep reminding people with the statistics? Can we keep reinforcing that that information, education is a prerequisite, and you have a choice. And what are the choices you make with your life? So there's a lot around experimentation during adolescence and early adulthood. But with those choices come certain responsibilities. And fundamentally, what it touches on is how we respect ourselves and how we respect each other. And when it comes to sex, it's not too different from social. So it is about understanding there's a virus there, and a virus that poses a threat. And here's all the options you have to make sure that when you are sexually active, these are the things that you can do. But there is another part of the epidemic, and particularly where in, I think, southern Eastern Africa, some parts of Africa, where sex is not always consensual. And we always think about sex as something pleasurable, which it is, but there are also circumstances where people don't have choice. And for example, in Africa, where we have seen many millions of parents die prematurely, their kids are now becoming young adolescents. We see child-headed households. We see people living in extreme poverty where their bodies and sex becomes ways to survive. And when you're talking about those, that's where interventions become really important, and where simply educating people is not sufficient. So I think where you have choice, wonderful, great. But where you don't have choice, what are the social and structural conditions that need to be altered that ensure protection of the vulnerable in society?
Well, on that positive note, Dr. Abdool Karim, thank you very much for joining us here on France 24. Now, for more exclusive interviews, don't forget to go to our website at france24.com. Coming up, more international news. Thanks for watching.
France 24 es rigurosidad, precisión y responsabilidad. Somos una familia comprometida con el periodismo y la verdad.
C'est une des seules chaînes d'infos où on nous laisse jouer en plateau avec des Legos, avec des robots, avec tout un tas d'objets.
We take a return ticket to revisit some of the key people and places of the last 50 years of world television news.
على فرانس 24 يمكننا أن نحاور أصحاب القرار من العالم في كل الميادين ولدينا المساحة لكشف ثنايا مسيرتهم.
Aquí en France 24 tenemos a varias personas de distintos países, algo que es un reflejo de cómo es Latinoamérica, con culturas muy distintas. Y allí es muy bonito encontrar que en el deporte todos tenemos algo en común.
Les femmes, elles sont souvent victimes de l'actualité internationale, mais ce sont aussi des actrices majeures de la géopolitique. Et d'ailleurs, on en parle dans France 24.